Okay, so I've been putting information on Moodle for you guys. I don't know if you noticed. Hopefully you went and visited the Moodle. Did anybody go through the last week's lectures? Did they work? Were they okay? Good, excellent. I didn't think it would come out for my first time. Wasn't too bad. So that's what I'm going to be doing from now on. I'll put all the recordings on Moodle for you guys, along with objectives and outline, which also today's objectives and outlines are there too. I follow the objectives pretty much throughout the lecture, but if I'm missing something, let me know. Stop me and say, hey, there's 1 or 2 objectives on this lecture that you haven't covered, and I'll make sure I'll say, you know what, I didn't cover it, so I won't ask you on the quiz, or thank you for reminding me, I'll cover it, and then we'll make sure it's on the quiz too. You know what I'm saying? So my lectures are not identical from year to year, so sometimes I don't cover things, but I still have them on objectives and vice versa. So I want to make sure I cover everything that you guys need and you guys need to know and in general. So chapter 3 is a big chapter. If you looked at it, there's lots of pictures, lots of pages. But I've divided it into 2. We're going to talk about the first part of chapter 3. We'll call it CT Brain. And then the second part of chapter 3 will go more into details of MRI. That doesn't mean that we won't look at MRI pictures today, but it just means that I'm going to be focusing on MRI next week a lot more. And we'll talk about physics of MRI a little bit. So that's what I want to do. But I do always want to divide this big chapter because I think there's too much information. When we divide it like this, it's better. Okay, so let's start with, obviously we're going to talk about the brain. We talked about skull and what covers the brain tissue, but now we're going to actually get into the soft tissue, get into the brain matter. And to know the brain, you have to know the layers that are on top of the brain, and those are called meninges, right? Have you heard of meningitis? Heard of meningitis. So inflammation of the meninges causes meningitis. So that's one of the things you might have heard of. But the meninges are the layers that cover the top of the brain tissue. And there are 3 layers of meninges on top. So why do we have these very thin layers on top of the brain tissue? Why not just have skull to take care of the protection of it? Cushion, right? What else?
To feed the brain, actually.
To
actually feed the brain.
Feed the brain, because there will be some cerebral spinal fluid that's hanging around those meninges. Correct. What else? So it's protection, it's... Huh?
Hangover.
Hangover. What is that? What's hangover?
What?
What's hangover?
Well,
What do you mean?
The day after you consume alcoholic beverage.
What do meninges do for hangover?
It keeps you alive.
Okay. I don't know about that. I don't know.
Jose cannot raise his hand anymore.
He didn't even raise his hand. But, okay. So, let's see if I can do this. Oh, I have a pen. What am I doing? My finger. They are having a good time next door. Okay, so when you're looking at the meninges, obviously, so I'm looking at the cranium, right? So that's the bone. Whatever is down here at the next to the bone will be the meninges and then the brain tissue. So you have the dura mater, which is the toughest part or toughest of the meninges, that's on the top. Then you have arachnoid, and then at the end you'll have pia mater. Dura mater is also called the tough mother. It's the toughest layer of the meninges. You've got the arachnoid, which looks like spider web. Arachnophobia. Did anybody see that movie? Jeff Bridges? No. Who played in Arachnophobia?
No, it was
Jeff Goldblum.
No. It was that.
Okay, never
It's
mind,
the other
never mind,
actor
it's
who was
alright.
in,
I'm thinking about.
It was the other actor in Dumb and Dumber who wasn't Jim Carrey. It was that actor.
Oh, I don't know. I can't remember. It's not Jeff Bridges. Never mind, it's okay, it's okay.
Alright, moving
If you haven't seen Arachnophobia, go see Arachnophobia. Anyways, so arachnoid is the middle layer that looks like spider webs. And then at the end, you have the pia matter, which is a very thin, delicate matter of the meninges, and it covers directly the cortex or the brain tissue. So what directly attaches the brain tissue is the pia matter. So you need to know those. So these, obviously the layers are not just layers there. There will be some spaces in between them. And those spaces are important to know. For example, when I talk about subdural matter, subdural space, what do I mean? Subdural space. Where is that? Sub, under, below, dural matter. So subdural space is the space between arachnoid and dural matter, right? How about subarachnoid space? Where's that between? Subarachnoid space. So subarachnoid space is underneath arachnoid, so it'll be between what and what? Arachnoid and pia matter, right? So you need to know those important spaces to know. Okay. How about epidural space? Epidural space. Above or below?
In between
In between what and what?
the cranium and the actual meninges.
Epidural matter, that's right. So epidural matter will be between the cranium and the dural matter. That's epidural. What have you heard about epidural space? Epidural shots, right? When you do injections, epidural injections. Have you guys done that in OR? Has anybody seen epidural injections? They do that for lower back pain all the time, epidural injections. And that's the space they go to.
The epidural space is between the cranium and...
Dural matter. Yes. All right. So at some point, I might have you actually draw this. You're going to draw the brain, and you're going to draw the three meninges and the spaces between them, which is pretty self-explanatory. It'll be good for you guys to practice and know all those spaces and the layers. Yes.
The little things that are coming out of going from the pia to the arachnoid,
The little things.
Yeah, those little. Would that be considered part of the arachnoid, or?
It is part of the arachnoid. So they're inside the subarachnoid space. They are part of the arachnoid. They're kind of underneath the arachnoid space, arachnoid layer. But if you look at it, it says subarachnoid space. So you can look at the arachnoid space and the layer kind of together. The space looks like the spider webs. All right. Okay, so when we talk about the brain tissue, again, there are several layers that divides different parts of the brain, and they're all called different. So what you're looking at is you're looking at the one side of the brain. It could be either the right side or the left side, doesn't matter. But you're looking at it at a sagittal view, as if somebody was cutting the middle of the brain into right and left, right? So when you're looking at it, there are other layers and there are other spaces that are in between these parts of the brain. One of them that's important is falx cerebri. Falx cerebri is actually one of the meninges, one of the layers that continues, and it divides the two cerebral hemispheres, the right and left hemisphere. So falx cerebri, if you're looking at it on the sagittal view, you can't really see it, but when you oblique it this way, you can actually see the space there, or the layer there. Falx cerebri. So what is, when we go into the next one, you'll see it better. there's actually a fissure in between the two hemispheres, right and left hemisphere. What is that fissure called? Do you remember from last year? Fissures are the very deep openings in between. Between the right and left hemisphere?
Isn't it the cerebral?
No. Longitudinal fissure. Remember longitudinal fissure? So in that longitudinal fissure, you will have the falx cerebri, which is the actual tissue or the layer that's dividing them. The fissure is the space. There's nothing, the fissure is just the space. The cerebri, the falx cerebri, is actually the layer or the tissue that divides the two. So those are two different things. Don't mix them up. Okay? There's also another layer that's separating the cerebrum first from cerebellum, which is the behind portion of the brain, and that's called tentorium. Tentorium cerebelli. So that will divide the very back portion of the brain, which is cerebellum, from cerebrum. And we'll look at another picture, you'll see what I mean. So those are the two important layers that you need to know. What divides what? Tentorium cerebelli and falx cerebri. And we'll get to them in. So when you're looking at an axial view like this, you should be able to see these tissues that are dividing the brain, right? Where are they? Okay, so you're looking at, first of all, this is where the axial cut has happened. All of this is this cerebrum, right? This is the frontal portion of the brain, and this is the back of the brain, which is called cerebellum. Something divides these two, and that's what we call tentorium cerebelli. This is what we were looking at. Tentorium cerebelli, or this division right here. So that's one of the layers. Yeah.
Does that also create a fissure, or is it just a separation?
It also yes, it does create a fissure, and we'll talk about it. It's a lateral fissure, yes. So tentorium cerebelli divides cerebellum from the cerebrum, right? Why can't I see falx cerebri that well? Is it too deep? It's running parallel? What's the answer? So you can actually see it. You can actually see the falx cerebri right here. But we're not cutting it sagittally so we can see the fissure well. And we're not in the mid brain to see it well. We're kind of lower. We're in the inferior portion of the brain, right? So if we were a little bit higher, we would be able to see the falx cerebri better. But it's still there. And that's the tissue that divides the brain how? Right and left. Sagittally, yes.
So in a sagittal plane, you wouldn't be able to see it.
On a complete mid-sagittal plane, you will not be able to see it because you're cutting it right there. If you were on a sagittal that's not completely mid-sagittal, you may be able, exactly. You may be able to see it. The best place to see it is on an axial and also coronals. We'll see some of the coronals and you'll see those. Okay. Aha. So, what is this image of? What plane is this? Coronal image, right? So you're looking at the coronal image. You're looking at the cerebellum and you're looking at cerebrum. See how now you're looking at right here. What is that? Falx cerebrum, exactly. And what is this one here? Tentorium cerebelli, exactly. Exactly. Very important, and you can see them on a coronal image really well.
Do those, when they go all the way down, do they meet? Or do they 100% meet, or not all the way through?
Well, if you look at it, if you look at it from this side, from a sagittal view, if one comes here and one comes from here, they kind of meet right there in the middle, where the fourth ventricle is. So they kind of meet there. All right. Let's see the next. What plane am I looking at? Sagittal. Where's anterior? Where's posterior? Anterior, right? There's posterior. So here's the mid-sagittal plane. Here's what we were asking. So anterior, posterior, right? Can you see the falx cerebri?
Well, it's over to
Can you see the falx cerebri? You can't. Your slice is right on it, so you won't be able to see the falx cerebri. Can you see tentorium cerebelli?
Yes.
Yes, you can, right? I wanted to go red. Here we go, red. So you can actually see the tentorium cerebelli right there, but the falx cerebri, we won't. Now, what's falx cerebelli?
Thank you.
That's another
the
name.
cerebellum sagittally.
Yes, so falx cerebelli is actually another layer that divides the cerebellum into two right and left sections. Okay, so that's different from falx cerebri. Okay, so those two different things. Cerebri has to do with cerebrum, has to do with the brain, the major portion of the brain. Cerebelli has to do with cerebellum, falx cerebellum, that divides cerebellum into two sections.
into the right and left, or
Correct, into right and left. So those are important to know. And we're going to get into a couple more, probably a few more pictures that you can see those a little bit better. And later on when we talk about cerebellum, you'll actually see it. You'll see it better. Now, let's get into the ventricular system. I think Alexander mentioned it really well. He said it actually, the layers actually feed the brain. And then we talked about, and I mentioned cerebrospinal fluid, right? So we have this cerebrospinal fluid that circulates inside the brain and spinal cord. So that's where the ventricular system comes in. And this YouTube video that I have, you can look at it later. It's actually about ventriculism. The art of not talking but getting the voice out there, ventriculism. So I showed it to my class last year, the difference between ventricular system and ventriculism. So you can look at it's a really funny video on America Got Talent. Somebody came and actually did the ventriculism. It was funny. Anyways, something to look at later on if you have a few minutes. But ventricular system is what we're going to talk about, and that has, which is the system that has the cerebrospinal fluid. We have several ventricles inside the brain, and most important one and the biggest one are the lateral ventricles. You're looking at right now. You're looking kind of on a lateral view of the ventricles, and you can see actually all of them. For example, you have the lateral ventricles right here, you have the third ventricle here, and you have the fourth ventricle over here. This is probably the only image that you can see all the ventricles together. And I don't think I've ever seen an actual MR or CT image that you can see all of them. This is just a picture.
It looks like the third ventricle arrow is like pointing
To that one space. Yeah, you're saying this.
No, it keeps going to like the lateral.
No, that's the line in the brain.
No, it doesn't keep going. No, this is just the brain there.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that's just the line on the tissue of the brain. But what I have read right there is the third ventricle.
Thanks.
I know that's kind of confusing, right? That line. Okay, let's see on a coronal image how we can see. On a coronal image like this, you can again see the lateral ventricles, which you'll see lateral ventricles on almost all CT and MR images. They're very prominent. They're usually dark on a CT image. Then you've got the third ventricle and then the fourth ventricle, that they all have to have connection between each other. Why? Why is there a connection between the ventricle system? Right, so if there's no connection, where does the CSF go? There has to be this continuous connection between these ventricles so that CSF can flow everywhere. What happens is actually a disease that can if the connection does not happen, what do we call that disease? What?
Just big brain, the hypercephaly.
Hydrocephaly. Hydrocephaly is one of them where the ventricles they have so much CSF in them that's not going anywhere, so it does make the brain kind of like water in the brain. Hydrocephaly. Okay. So let's see a little bit more. So here's an MR image of axial MRI image, right? I know we said CT of the brain, but we're looking at a lot of MR images because MRs show a lot better soft tissue than we ever want. So you're looking at the ventricles. Again, in an MR image like this, you'll look at the ventricles and they'll be dark. You don't want to see anything inside the ventricles. You don't want to see any calcifications. That would be an abnormal looking. But the reason I have this image is that this is an axial MRI image where you can't really see all the ventricles, every part of the ventricles. Why is that? It depends on the slice, right? So this slice, let's see. Look at that slice. The slice is not right in the middle of the brain, so you can't really see everywhere all the parts of the ventricles. You can see maybe the anterior portion and maybe the posterior portion of the ventricles, but not the middle. So all has to do with where you're taking that slice. Which part of the brain are you? And then what can you see? What part of that structure can you see? So it's really important to know where you are.
Do we need to know anterior horn versus occipital horn of the lateral ventricles, or just?
You do need to know the different parts of the lateral ventricles, like where is the anterior, exactly, where is the anterior horn, where is the posterior. You need to know those, yes. All right, here's the same area. What's the difference on this image?
CT?
This is a CT, right. This is a CT versus MRI. So again, you're looking at ventricles, but you're not seeing the middle portion of the ventricles. You're just seeing the anterior and the posterior portion. 3V means third ventricle. You can also see the third ventricle on this one. All right, next. I like this image more than anything because these sagittal images show really well where everything is. I think we looked at it before. Here we're looking at the ventricles again. It's a sagittal view, so you can see more anterior portion and then posterior portion of the ventricles. What's the white stuff on top of the ventricle? No, what's this? What's that structure that's in the middle of the brain that connects the corpus callosum? Right, important to know. I know you had maybe just a short lecture about these structures of the brain, but you got to remember them again. So corpus callosum, what does it do?
Coordinates the two hemispheres and allows them to talk with each other. And
Right, so it connects the two hemispheres, the right and left hemispheres. They actually say corpus callosum on women is thicker. Why is that? Because we can multitask and do things at the same time, where in men, the right and left brain sometimes don't connect with each other. I'm serious. This is a fact. This is something that's been proven. So when they do those function MRIs and they do these kind of research MRIs, they can actually see the difference between the corpus callosum of a female patient versus a male patient. It all has to do with biology, guys. It all has to do with what we've got in the brain and in our bodies and how it's being used. So if your corpus callosum is thick enough, it can make more connections, and you can make those right and left hemisphere connections, and you can do more multitasking. So it's not your fault, guys. It's the way you were built. Excuse, no. You can always learn. All right. Another CT image. You're looking at now, we're looking at the fourth ventricle. Again, I said you need to know all the ventricles, the lateral ventricles, third ventricle, and then the fourth ventricle. We had one picture before where there's actually a connection between third and fourth ventricle. Again, you need to know all those connections and all those. Show you an image like this, you should be able to tell me where the fourth ventricle is. The connection between the fourth and third ventricle is somewhere here, this little tube area, and it's actually, it's called, what is it called? Sylvian aqueduct, I think. Let me go. Cerebral?
Yeah.
Cerebral aqueduct? Or Sylvius aqueduct. Yes, Sylvius. Yeah, it's Sylvius or Sylvian aqueduct based on a Dutch anatomist who actually figured it out. So, couple of names. Cerebral aqueduct, Sylvian aqueduct, all of those. It's basically the connection between the third ventricle, which you can't see here, and the fourth ventricle. Let's see. Next. All right, we'll go into cisterns in just a little bit. So is everybody clear about ventricles and where they are and how they're connected? Questions? Okay. We'll go into cisterns now. So heard of cisterns and what they are? Yes,
Oh.
Alexander.
Do you mean in the architectural term or in the anatomy term?
Architectural. No, we're talking about anatomy, I
Oh,
think.
well, I
Anatomy term, cisterns. But I'd like to know what is it in architectural
Well,
terms?
a cistern. This is my experience with it. A cistern is it's like an underground well. It's a built underground well to store water.
Okay.
And I know that is because there's a very famous cistern that was actually used in, I think, filming of Indiana Jones. I visited there in Istanbul actually a couple years ago. And it's built underneath what used to be the Hippodrome in Istanbul. There's a bit of a stairwell that goes all the way down it. And yeah, it's a gigantic, it's like it's with cavern. There's columns, there's vaulted columns there leading all the way up to the ground up above, and it's held the groundwater, well, it held the water that hydrated, well, Byzantium back in the day. And I'm
Okay.
assuming that's what the cistern does here. It just tells the CSF.
That's true. It's absolutely true. It's cisterns are pools of CSF in the brain. They not only keep the CSF, they actually make CSF in there as well. And there are several of them. So why do we have to know cisterns and their locations? What's so important?
Look for blockages. No
So we can
obstructions.
look for blockages, so we can see if they're blocked. Yes, that's
Where do you expect it to be?
good answer. Where we expect them to be so that,
If it's not there or in somewhere else, you know there's a problem.
right, and also so that if we see them all of a sudden in the brain, we don't think there's an abnormality. We should know where the cisterns are so that we don't make a fool of ourselves and say, oh, maybe that's a bleed there. No, that's a cistern. So we need to know where the locations of the cisterns are because sometimes they do look like an abnormal area in the brain. The more you know about normal anatomy, the more you get yourself familiar when you see a pathology. So that's why cisterns are important. Good thing about cisterns is that there's a few of them in the brain and you'll need to know a few of them. And then when you look at names, for example, Pontine cistern, what does that mean?
Oh, near the pond.
Yeah, it's near the ponds. Their names are associated with the structures that are around them. So it's easier to detect them, it's easier to recognize them. So Pontine cistern is right here, it's near ponds. Cisterna magna, and I'm going to point the ones that I want you to know, and I want you to know their locations. So Cisterna magna is one of the biggest cisterns. And if you were going to locate cisterna magna, how would you locate it? And I want you to use your anatomy terms. So it's that area. Where is it? So you're going to use your cross-sectional anatomy terms, and you're going to tell me where is cisterna magna.
So it's inferior.
Inferior to cerebellum, right? Because this is the cerebellum right here, right? So it's inferior to cerebellum. What about posterior to something?
The pontine cistern.
Posterior, not quite to pontine cistern, but how about what's this area? Posterior to the brainstem, right? So inferior to cerebellum, posterior to brainstem. Does anybody need to, do I need to go over the structures of the brain? Does everybody remember everything? Yeah.
Where's the pons versus the brainstem? Is it just like, it goes down into the brainstem?
Okay, so this is the brainstem going down. This is pons. This is medulla oblongata going down. So the first part of kind of like the brain system is medulla oblongata, and then this is pons. So yeah, remind me if anybody does not remember the brain structures, let me know, and we'll go over them quickly. Because I'm assuming you guys know these simple structures. Cerebellum, everybody should know, right? Cerebellum? Okay. All right, let's see. What other cisterns do I need you to know? I'm going to go to the cisterns, though. No, there's some more. Don't worry. Okay, here's a axial view that talks about a few more cisterns that I want you to know. Trust me, there's so many of them. Supercellular cistern. That's one. That's another one that I want you to know. Supercellular cistern. So where do you think that is? Right around the cella turcica. That's what the name comes from. Supercellular. Supercellular is above. So it's above the cella turcica. Supercellular cistern is one to know. Just get yourself familiar with like ambient cistern, quadrigeminal cistern. Know where they are, but they're not as important as the ones that I mentioned before. Ambient cistern, quadrigeminal cistern. We talked about cisterna magna. Important to know that one, definitely. Okay. This is a CT image. It's really hard on the CT images to locate cisterns, so I probably won't ask you something like this to identify cisterns on this reference page. Same thing, really reference image. So this is what I was talking about when I said you might make a mistake between the cistern, what's normal and what's abnormal. All of a sudden you're looking at a CT image and you look at that black area. You're like, oh my God, the patient is bleeding or something. But it's not. It's really the location of the cistern. So you need to see more of these CT images, more of the MR images to get your brain sort of, what'd you say? What's the word? Acclimated, yes, used to, your brain gets used to what's normal. And then you'll be able to determine what is abnormal. Yeah.
You can tell me if we're going to cover this later, but for the relaxation times for blood and CSF, aren't they different?
Yes.
So that you wouldn't necessarily notice a black space if you do the weighting to remove the CSF, right?
After you inject the contrast, you mean? Yeah, you wouldn't know.
Okay.
This is what you would see before. This is pre. This is scan when without contrast. Correct. Yes, and we will cover contrast and how it would look like with contrast and without. Okay, so let's talk about cerebrum just a little bit. There's again this is not a funny video, it's just a YouTube video talking about cerebrum and different parts of it. It's a good refresher if you want to look. But what I want to cover really is what we call cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex, the brain, which has gray matter and white matter, right? And the gray matter is mostly on the superior portion of the brain. It's about 3 to 5 millimeters is gray matter. The rest that's underneath that is all white matter, right? And when you look at the brain, it's all, it has all of these gyri and soci. It's not all the smooth surface, right? Why is that? Why is our brain all jumbled up in that little space?
Surface area.
Increase the surface area, right? Because the millions and millions of neurons that we have in our brain, if we didn't have it this way, condensed like this, we couldn't have that many brain cells in there. So you've got the brain cells, you've got the brain tissue, gray matter and white matter, and we'll talk about neurons in just a second. This picture is really good again because it shows the different structures that we just mentioned. You've got the corpus callosum, you've got the cerebellum, you even have the fourth ventricle. Some of the other stuff we didn't talk about, like pineal gland, we will talk about later when we talk about MRI. But things that are important on this image, I would say, cerebellum, fourth ventricle, the entire cerebrum. You've got the corpus callosum. You have the pons right here, medulla oblongata going down. And then when you talk about corpus callosum, do you remember the different parts of it, right? So the anterior portion of the corpus callosum is called rostrum. Then you've got genu, body, and then at the end you've got splenium of corpus callosum. It's important to know all of those areas of corpus callosum. So what is this now here? The area that I made blue. Right inferior to the cerebellum. It's the ventricle. It's the lateral ventricle. This is just a picture, obviously. It's a cartoon picture, so it's not like a CT or MR where you can see it black, but that's where the lateral ventricle would be. Right underneath the cerebellum. Alrighty, go next. This talks about the different fissures that are important of the cerebrum. So first let's talk about the gyrus and sulcus. What are the gyri and sulci? Sulcus is for one, sulci is for more than one, right, plural. Gyrus is one, gyri is more than one. So you see gyrus and sulcus. What are those?
Gyrus like the sulcus is the line and the sulcus is the down.
Right, the sulcus is the deep, right? It's like the valley of the brain. Sulcus or sulci are the when you get deep. But gyrus is what? What comes over it, right? So gyrus is this. Gyrus is this portion that's bulky portion, and then when it comes down, it becomes the sulcus. That's all it is. These are the bulges all around the cerebrum. Yes.
I thought that the, what was it called?
Gyrus?
Tentorium cerebelli divides the cerebellum and the cerebrum and creates the lateral fissure, but it says the lateral fissure goes through the cerebrum.
You're right. Absolutely. I was wrong. Sylvian fissure or lateral fissure is right here. It goes through the cerebrum.
So then is
What goes the cerebellum, the tentorium cerebelli does not make the lateral fissure. It will make one of the fissures of the brain, but it's not the lateral fissure.
So the lateral fissure is going through, it's basically like perpendicular to the longitudinal fissure on the cerebrum itself?
Kind of longitudinal, yes. So if you're looking at the lateral of the longitudinal fissure like that, this is the lateral fissure or Sylvian fissure. So it is only, it goes into the cerebrum, it has nothing to do with the cerebellum.
So it's like anterior posterior cerebellum?
Anterior posterior cerebellum.
Where's it? Cerebrum.
Cerebrum, not cerebellum, cerebrum. So you have two main fissures in the brain, in the cerebrum, right? One of them is the longitudinal fissure, which is between the right and left hemisphere, and the other one is the lateral fissure, or sylvian fissure, which cuts through the side portion of the cerebrum. So those are the two fissures you need to know. Let's not mix it up with tentorium cerebelli and all of those. We'll have another picture that'll show that. So if you're looking at the brain, for example, the sylvian fissure, you can say it's between the frontal lobe and temporal lobe. So what divides the two lobes, the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe, is the sylvian fissure. Okay? So the lobes come up very important as well. We talked about the skull and for example, the temporal lobe of the skull. So right underneath the temporal lobe of the skull, you have the temporal lobe of the brain, which have every lobe of the brain also has a different function that we'll talk about, but it's important to know. So you've got the frontal lobe, you have the temporal lobe, and you have occipital lobe shown here. Also parietal lobe here. So all of them are shown.
What was the other fissure that you wanted to know, the lateral and the
Longitudinal fissure, yes. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So this one is a sagittal view. It's an MRI sagittal view. This is to show you what the gyri and soci would look like in an MRI, and also to show you what is gray matter, what's white matter. So you're actually looking at gray matter, white matter in an MRI a lot better than in CT. And if you see, you got 3 to 5 millimeters of gray matter on top, or the cerebral cortex, and then you have the white matter, and then you have more gray matter in the middle of the brain, which all has to do with what function these structures are doing for our brain. So what does gray matter do? What do you think gray matter does for the brain, depending on what neurons are in there? It's not myelinated. Gray matter. It's not myelinated, no. But what does it do? My point is, what does gray matter do for you? As far as sensory. Think about sensory.
Where the cell body is?
Yes, that's where the cell body is. However, what does it do? What's the
It
function?
receives information coming from outside the brain, from the extremities, all the different, what was it, 12 nerves? 12 nerves.
Cranial nerves. So it receives the sensory. It receives the sensory information from all parts of the body. That's what gray matter does. What does it do with that information? Sends it to the white matter.
Yes.
And white matter is where the myelinated sheath are. Myelinated sheath, that's where they make the connections. If we don't have the white matter here, how would the cerebral cortex make a connection between middle of the brain? So that's why we have the white matter. And going back to myelinated sheath, yeah. So I'm going to go really quickly, go to the neuron, right? Do you remember your neurons? Dendrites, right? My picture is not good, I know. And you've got the axon, right? Axons. So if I wanted to divide the neuron into two, the top part would be the gray matter. The lower part would be white matter. It's the axons portion, which is the axon. It's the axon portion of the neuron that is in the white matter and conducts all that transmission from the top of the brain to the bottom, to the midbrain, right? So the gray matter is the dendrites and the cell body. And dendrites are transmitting information from everywhere in the body towards the nerve, and then this is the neuron. So you've got millions and millions of neurons that are making these connections between each other, and that's how you can hear, that's how you can get all the senses from outside. Okay? So how do we send information out? Right? How do we do that? Let's say gray matter gets the information, it sends it to the brain. What do we do next? You touch something hot. All of a sudden you raise your hand like that. How does that happen? You receive the information, and then your midbrain, middle of the brain, sends that information. Thalamus, hypothalamus, all of that, send the information to your hand saying, take your hand away, it's too hot. So that's how the gray matter, white matter work. Okay. Next, let's see. You can look at that pathology website again later, but I'm going to just mention a few pathology that can happen in the brain before we get into logistics of it.
What are these things that we need to know, to be aware of?
Just to be aware of, because I don't know if I want to show you all the CT/MR images with pathology. There are a few. I think there are a few that your book mentions. I think there are a couple pictures. And I want to see if I have some pictures to show. But if I don't have images for you guys on my PowerPoint, I don't expect you to know them on the test. That website that I showed you is really good just to go in and take a look. You don't have to go into complicated ones. Just go to the brain pathology and look at some of the pathologies and just look at the images. Get your brain acclimated. Get your brain used to looking at these pathologies, and the more you look at them, the better it is for you. Okay, so here's another axial view of the brain that shows many things that we talked about, including longitudinal fissure. So here's the longitudinal fissure right there. That's one of the biggest fissures in the brain. And here's the Sylvian fissure. That's another important fissure in the brain. So what's inside the longitudinal fissure? We were told that longitudinal fissure divides the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. What do we know now? It's a falx cerebri that divides, makes that division. It's the space that's called longitudinal fissure. Okay? So there's a layer of tissue that divides them. That's called falx cerebri. But it's a space that there's nothing in it. That space or fissure is called longitudinal fissure. Don't make the mistake between the two. It's really important. Okay? So is everybody clear what's the difference between longitudinal fissure and falx cerebri?
What's the tissue in between the lateral fissure?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know what the tissue is between, but that's a good question. You don't need to know that if I don't know. But I'm sure it's in the book somewhere. It's a good question. Okay. It also shows white matter, gray matter, which is, again, important to know. It shows the third ventricle and thalamus. We'll talk about those a little bit later, maybe even next week. It also, what else? Oh, it shows corpus callosum as well. So it's a good picture, shows a lot of different structures that we talked about. All right. Here's almost the same area in an MRI. It's a coronal image, this one. Again, it shows white matter, gray matter, shows the third ventricle, some of the other ones that we talked about. See an image, and if you see structures that we didn't even mention, I didn't even mention them, you don't need to know them, obviously. I'm more interested in you knowing the structures that we talked about and identify them on an image. This is just different parts of corpus callosum. No big deal. Another axial MRI that shows the longitudinal fissure. Coronal with longitudinal fissure. I know your book is full of these images. And almost the same with cerebral cortex, gray matter, white matter. Before I finish that, I want to make sure everybody knows the cerebral lobes and their functions. So on your book on page 108, you actually have all the lobes of the cerebrum, and it mentions their functions. For example, frontal lobe, you need to know it has to do with your personality and behavior, emotion, intellectual functions. Your parietal lobes, that have to do with sensations. Occipital lobe has to do with, that's really famous, vision, right? And then you have temporal lobe, which has to do with hearing and smell, obviously, right? Temporal lobe has all the ears behind it. Yeah, Sarah.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. The functions you want me to? It's in the book, though. I don't.
I know what page in the book.
Oh, 108. 108. Thank you. Yeah, stop me if I'm going too fast or you're not understanding something, please.
Emotions is in the frontal lobe or parietal?
Sensation is parietal. Vision is occipital. Hearing and smell is temporal. And frontal lobe does a lot of stuff. Personality, behavior, emotion, all of that. And this is what I was talking about. Hey. Page 108. Okay. Go into here. This one, it's an MRI image that shows all the lobes. Axial image. Here's a mid-sagittal image that we've seen again and again. Again, I can't emphasize these sagittal images of MR are really good because they show so many structures that we talk about and we don't normally see on CTs. So take a look here. Coronal image, it's mostly from the frontal lobe of the brain, right? You can't really see. You can only see the anterior portion of the lateral ventricles right here. The rest you can't really see. And that's obvious because we're not going through the lateral ventricles all the way. Axial image of a CT. This is interesting. Because I'm going to cover up to limbic system. So I need to cover thalamus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland. Okay. You know what's bad about this is that I can't see my other slides forward, so I can't always see what's going on.
Where it says slide number. If you
Where does
click
it
on that,
say?
shows you.
Oh, does it? Yay! Oh, that's what I want to see. Okay. IT man. I like my IT man. Okay, so that's good. That's good. Let's go. Okay, so I like this one better. So this one shows some of the structures that we didn't talk about yet, and that's in the middle of the brain. Remember how I said you've got the gray matter, you have white matter, and then more gray matter in the middle of the brain. That's where your thalamus and hypothalamus comes. Those are the middle of the brain. They actually connect many parts of the brain together. Question back there?
Sorry.
Okay. So you have thalamus and hypothalamus, and you have pituitary gland that we talked about a little bit last time. Those are all important structures to know. For example, thalamus has two large gray matters right around it. And basically, what thalamus does, it serves as a relay station from the cerebral cortex all the way to the middle of the brain. So it's a relay station. Hypothalamus, it's smaller and it's above thalamus, and I think we saw a few pictures with hypothalamus in it. And it also has many important functions. Hypothalamus has to do with endocrine system. It maintains homeostasis. So you can imagine regulation of the temperature of the body. You can imagine if your thalamus or hypothalamus gets injured, a lot can happen to your body. Very important. And then hypothalamus and pituitary gland, they also connect with each other, which we'll look at in just a second. We kind of talked about pituitary gland last time. We said it's called master gland. It's very important. It secretes a lot of glands that are, a lot of hormones that are very important to our body. And it's also situated in, where in the brain? Sella turcica, right. Master gland, hypophysis, or pituitary gland. So that's the different names for it. Was that one of the questions? Aha, okay. So, master gland, master, like he's the master of the glands. Question, yes.
You said it was above the thalamus, but in page 114, it looks like it's inferior. Hypo normally means below.
Hypothalamus. You're right, absolutely. I made a mistake. It is underneath the thalamus. So you're right. When you look at an image like this, you'll see it. So here's the thalamus, the gray matter right there. Here's hypothalamus, which is inferior to it. Exactly. Thank you very much for that. So that's the hypothalamus right there. And this is the area I was talking about where hypothalamus is in connection with pituitary gland. So you're looking at hypothalamus. Here's a connection between the two, and then here's the pituitary gland. Later on, you'll see why there's a connection. For example, pituitary gland needs to secrete something, but it doesn't know how to. Your body says something to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus secretes certain hormones to the pituitary gland, and then pituitary gland secretes those hormones. So they're constantly in connection with each other, and they secrete, this one secretes hormones to this one, and then this secretes hormones to the rest of the body. Very important, hypothalamus and pituitary gland. And the little connection that's between them is called infundibulum. So infundibulum is the connection that's between hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Important to know.
What was it called?
Infundibulum, right there.
Isn't that the same thing as with the master?
Yeah, we had anything you have a connection that's long and connection between the two, it's called infundibulum. This one happens to be in the brain, but it's different than the one in the nasal bone. Okay?
So the thalamus talks to the hypothalamus, which goes to the infundibulum, whatever, to the pituitary gland.
For the most part, hypothalamus does a lot on his own. So hypothalamus talks to pituitary gland.
Okay.
That's the main connection you want to make there. Thalamus is separate. Hypothalamus is separate. Hypothalamus is the one that controls pituitary gland. And then pituitary gland controls a lot of the hormone secretions in the body. That's why it's called master gland. Okay. Before we adjourn, there's the, okay, here. I think in one of the images I had a picture of pineal gland. Pineal gland, you were able to see it on some of the axial images really well. For example, on page 109. Which one?
It's on this picture on this.
Oh, is it on this picture too? PG? Pineal gland. Yes. Oh, I'm so glad. I thought I didn't have it here. Okay. So PG here, pineal gland. The reason I want you to know pineal gland is that in most CT images, pineal gland is calcified, which means you'll see it as a white spot, which means sometimes you could say, oh, maybe that's a calcification that's not supposed to be there. But it is supposed to be there. It's a pineal gland, and actually pineal gland has to do with our sleep patterns. So when pineal gland gets damaged, our sleep pattern gets damaged. It's because of the hormone melatonin that it secretes. Remember have you heard of melatonin? the hormone that makes you sleepy, or the hormone that regulates your sleep patterns. So if pineal gland gets damaged, your sleep pattern gets damaged, and that's important. For the most part, pineal gland is calcified when you look at it on a CT. I know I had an image with the calcified pineal gland, but I can't find it right now.
107.
Was it 107? Thank you. 107. The MRI image that you're looking at, is that the one?
Oh, yeah, looks like it.
There was on
Oh, you're 116. Yeah.
116, thank you. Yes, that's the one, and I had that one on one of my sign. It says calcified pineal gland. So 116 is CT image, and it's in the middle of the brain, and it's calcified. Really important to know. It's something that you'll see it over and over, and things that I need to tell you. No, it's normally calcified. Right, normally, it's a normally calcified.
So that's
Is
not
that
that.
non-functioning?
It is not malfunctioning when it's calcified. No, it's normally calcified.
What
Yeah.
causes the calcification?
I don't know where the calcification comes from, but it's very normal to see a pineal gland calcified. I don't know where the calcification comes. It could be because of having too much melatonin. I don't know. All right, so let's see. I want whoever, okay, so I want to go by groups. You all know your groups now, right? You know which group you're part of. So don't all blur out the answers. I'm going to say, for example, somebody in group 3, raise your hand and answer this, okay? So the dural fold separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum is called group 3. Somebody in group 3, raise your hand.
Long nose.
Long is in group 3, yes, go ahead.
Historian cerebellum.
Yes, C is the correct answer. Yes. Lung is shy, but he was in the group. All right. I want group 5 to answer this. Somebody in group 5. Matt, Jill, Priyanka, Jeffrey, Jason. Frontal lobe's functions are
D, all of the above.
all of the above. Correct. Correct. I think I have one more. Group 6. Tammy, Margarita, Rohit, Adelicia, and or Brian. Temporal lobe's main function is vision and balance. False. Thank you. Raise your hand next time so I know who's answering. Very good. Okay. Questions?
Anita wanted to come to talk to us before I ran into her in the hallway.
She said she wanted to come talk to us.
So should I go
Okay.
grab her?
Yeah, if you want. I can call her.